Let me ask you guys a question. I'm going to be a little bit provocative here. I'm trying to put myself in the position of one of my Jewish students. I just had a wonderful conversation with this young man yesterday. I won't identify him further, but we were just sharing because I had signed a letter here at Brown of faculty calling an open letter, calling for a ceasefire, and have been catching no end of flack because of that, you know. And people want to know what side I'm on, and they feel like, it's a pat retort, but here it is. Ceasefire benefits Hamas. They started this. There was a ceasefire before October 7th, and they broke it when they attacked those people in southern Israel. It was a slaughter. We got to finish the job, got to root out Hamas. It's necessary. The Americans bombed Hiroshima, they firebombed Dresden. This is war. You got to do what you got to do, kind of thing like that. And what I'm trying to get at is that people are viewing this conflict in existential terms. Now, Hamas did, in fact, slaughter viciously and brutally in a pogrom-like attack, many, many hundreds. And hundreds have been taken captive. It was just a horrific thing. For you to get up and give a speech that says, go Hamas, Israel is reaping what it has sown, to say that that's an act of violence it seems to me, not far off in terms of creating a fundamental condition of insecurity for people who feel like their lives are back on line. You call it safetyism, Danny. I'm giving voice to this point of view. This is not necessarily my opinion, but I'm just saying I can hear this kid that I was talking to yesterday saying this.
So my response is that the framing is just wrong on almost every empirical sense. And at some point that has to matter, right? You have to be aware of the history of the 56 years of occupation. You have to be aware that one side is a nuclear armed power with one of the most advanced militaries in the world. The other side is not. There is not an excuse for any of the brutalities that Hamas committed. But to compare any Palestinian organization to the Japanese Imperial Army or Nazi Germany is on its face absurd. A pogrom is a thing. It's not just a word that indicates when Jews are killed. It referred to a majoritarian attack on a minoritarian population, mostly in the Pale of Settlement in early 20th century Ukraine. And the Israel of 2023, I think this is the real issue when you're talking about Jews. Jews are socialized into a world where Israel is still the relatively state of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, when the 1973 Arab-Israeli War posed some sort of genuine existential threat to Israel. That hasn't been the case for literal decades. So at some point, you have to understand what is the actual empirical reality on the ground. It's a major force supported by the world empire with basically unlimited money and weapons, occupying a very weak population. When you come to the West Bank, you have the settlement community and the occupation, the building of, for example, highways that Palestinians aren't able to drive on. And in Gaza, you have an over decade-long blockade in an area where the population is 50% of the population is under 17. At some point, reality has to matter. Right? At some point, you have to understand that it's not 1973 any longer. Just like you guys always say, it's not 1965 anymore. It's not 1900 any longer. You have to take reality into account. So the question as educators is, how do you legitimize someone's felt, particularly a young Palestinian who's going to Brown, I imagine was socialized in a particular Jewish community, an American Jewish community that has consciously for 50 years equated Jewishness with support of Israel. But you have to ask people to look at reality. Otherwise, then what are we doing? Then any emotional response to anything is legitimate, and that's that.
If it's not a pogrom, and I agree, that's a stretch of how to use it since 1973, and it's not a noble rebellion, I can't quite go for that either when you're talking about 1,200 people. Is there a word for it?
It was a horrible act of political violence that resulted in the murder of a number of civilians and hostage taking that, is illegal under international law. It is immoral according to, liberalism and all of our various thoughts, but it is explicable, is what I would say. What are the conditions that led to this horrible event?
Well, wait a minute, Danny, and I want Tyler to get in. I see he wants to get in. I just want to say it's terrorism, man. This is, again, I'm just going to continue to channel this thing. You expect us to live with this on our border? You expect us to accept this as the necessary consequence of fulfilling the ambitions of Theodore Herzl and company? No nation would accept it. Why are you asking us to accept it?
So let me respond very quickly.
And what's wrong with using the word terrorism, by the way? I mean, this is simply, you want to stay in touch with reality? Let's stay in touch with reality.
Sure. I mean, I would point that person to the work of Lisa Stampnitsky, who has done an analysis of the category of terrorism. It is basically just a way to delegitimize particular forms of political violence. Now, you could either say that's fine because on decide what you want to do in that instance is delegitimize that form of political violence. That's a political act. That's fine. But empirically, this is what the term does. And I leave it up to you and your God to determine whether you're going to use it. Now, the question that then is the answer that then you respond by basically annihilating a population. It's a little bit of an absurd claim because Benjamin Netanyahu has been funding Hamas for years. This is part of a particular political strategy by the Israeli political government to basically pacify Gaza and focus on settlement in the West Bank as the Israeli government has become more far right, etc. So, I mean, if you're so concerned with Hamas, maybe you shouldn't fund it. But whatever. Even barring that, I think you have to look at the root causes of the actual issue. That's what I would say to that.
I agree, Glenn. I would call it terrorism. I think that's the appropriate designation. One of my frustrations is the reticence of a certain, I think, comparatively small corner of the left, it should be said, to just outright say it was terrorism. But at the same time, I think there were material conditions and historical conditions at work which make it explicable. And explicable is not to say excusable, but rather explicable in the sense of an outgrowth of policy decisions and material circumstances that have prevailed for decades. In the same way that 9/11 was explicable in terms of a broader American empire and, the decisions we had made over the decades leading up to that, right? And that doesn't mean, like all the lunatics on TikTok that have suddenly seemingly discovered Osama bin Laden's letter, right? That was an excusable act of terrorism.
So I just read A Letter to America, and I will never look at life the same. I will never look at this country the same. Please read it.
It just means that it didn't drop out of the sky. We need to contextualize things in the sort of, broader geopolitical ecosystem in which they occur.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
Such a fine line. Explicable, excusable. I would have to say, what isn't explicable?
Explicable.
Like
sure.
What?
Everybody's got a story.
Yeah, just a fine line.
Yeah. No, I mean,
no one's. It's so fringe to excuse Hamas. I mean, it is just not a mainstream position for most people in the United States to agree with the killing of civilians. To me, it's a chimera to even argue that this is like a real position worth arguing with, in my opinion.
I think the discussion would be different if Hamas had attacked an Israeli military installation. That is not what happened. But I also think it's worth noting that there are a lot of people who even are disputing the extent to the crimes of October 7th. And I don't even just mean the sort of debate over whether or not babies were beheaded, but, the question of rape and, a lot of really true horrors that we have, I think, pretty good anecdotal and visual evidence to suggest took place. There is this reticence to sort of even admit any of it happened. And I think that's all disturbing. But, nonetheless, I think I tend to agree with Danny that we should contextualize what happened, which is resolutely not to say excuse, but, Netanyahu was allowing Hamas to be funded. I think that's not a trivial detail in all this. And just as a last point, Glenn, you mentioned the sort of safetyism question. And, one of the reasons I think this has been so conflictory on college campuses is that I think a certain kind of Jewish student who now does feel insecure and unsafe. And whether that's reasonable or not, let's set that aside. I know Danny might not think so. I know, Glenn, maybe you do. But setting aside whether or not that's reasonable, these students for the last half decade have been told that your experience of feeling insecure is proof that you are, that we need to believe anyone who says they've encountered racism, right? That feeling like you've encountered racism is proof that a racism happened, right? And so, I think it's totally understandable why Jewish students now, with a particular politics, are saying, why don't you believe me? I'm saying I feel insecure, and yet it doesn't seem to be garnering the same outpouring of support, the same institutional response that happens when a Black student says, I experienced racism and feel insecure. Students are just applying the standards that have been applied to other groups for a decade. I would just insist that we should understand these students' responses, whether we think they're reasonable or not, or whether we think fear is overblown or not, as perfectly consonant and just an application of principles that have been at work for a decade. If you don't like the student attitudes, right, we're supposed to be educating them. And this is a series of institutional failures from universities, but also from legislators who have not done the work of regulating things like TikTok and social media and everything else, right? And so I guess I have a lot of sympathy for where students are coming from, in the sense of their response has often been bad, but I think the pump was primed in a certain way through actions that had nothing to do with them,
And I think I would add to that a generation of Jewish students are going to be imprinted by the fact that they feel persecuted, and they can point to episodes of stark resistance, physical violence, near physical violence, naked slurs hollered at them by people in real time. All of that on campuses is becoming regular. And there's a whole contingent of supposedly educated people telling them to shut up. Whereas, let's face it, racism on college campuses exists, but frankly, I can confidently say essentially no Black student for 50 years has encountered anything that stark. You have to work to find the quote unquote microaggressions, et cetera. And yet, anytime a Black student claims racism, then we have to pretend that college campuses are hotbeds of bigotry. That's not fair. And Jewish students are watching this and they're disgusted. And I would have to say, that's explicable. I understand their disgust about that.
But they're getting the support of the administration. I mean, every administration.
Who are getting that support?
Jewish students. I mean, it's SJP and SVP that is being thrown off campus. There's all these silencing.
So which Jewish students? Because here at Brown, 50 Jewish students sat in at the administration building and were arrested and carted away by the gendarme for occupying, and they were demanding a ceasefire. That's why they were there.
Right. And this
so which Jewish students?
This is the big thing in the American Jewish community. If you're under 40, you're basically critical of Israel. And if you're over 40, you're not. This is why APEC and the ADL are really pushing Christian Zionism. I mean, basically, both Israel and the American Jewish institutions recognize that the next generation of Jews, who are basically third or fourth generation Jews at this point, who have become part of the elite, not totally, but to a large degree, and accept, liberal values and don't like seeing a state oppress a population, that are not going to be as pro-Israel, even though I think in the long term it's not pro-Israel, but that's a different conversation, quote unquote, what they define as pro-Israel. And so they're moving toward Christian Zionism. So this is another,
But wait a minute. If I'm one of these Jewish students, and like Tyler was just referring to, I see people saying, well, the Hamas really didn't do what you all said they did. And start splitting hairs with me. There were no beheaded babies. Nobody was actually set on fire. Where's your proof that whatever? And you've got all of this, as Tyler remarked, evidence, circumstantial, and some of it more than circumstantial, that a horrific thing happened there. What am I to think about the person who's saying to me, with their arms folded across their chest, how many people really died? How many people really died? I think they're Jew haters is what I think. I mean, flip the script.
Is anti-Zionism?
Suppose somebody said to you, not that many people died during slavery.
So this gets,
So why isn't a Jewish student sympathetic to Israel entitled to feel, this is at the tail end of boycott, divest, and sanction. I mean, this fight about the moral status of the state of Israel has been going on for a long time. So Jewish students friendly to Israel are already feeling embattled. And now something horrific like this happens, and they get the Norman Finkelstein treatment from people at, you're overplaying your hand, you Zionist. So why shouldn't they feel threatened?
I mean, it probably doesn't feel great, but in the moment. But you also, if you have racism against you, does it totally change your existential view of life, your entire Weltanschauung? Again, that's between everyone and their God. I mean, this is the issue: is that anti-Zionism is that anti-Semitism. The state of Israel for 50 years has said, yes, it is. American Jewish institutions have said, Yes, it is. I would say it's a bit more complicated than that in the year 2023. Now, the fact that a Jewish student totally identifies with Israel due to various processes of socialization, I would understand it probably feels pretty terrible for people to deny what I consider to be an obvious truth, that there was atrocities committed against civilians and there was various war crimes committed by a Palestinian political group against civilians. To me, that seems undeniable, but it raises more interesting questions than how you feel in the moment, young person. Is college just a never-ending series of emotional reactions to things? Or are we supposed to get at a deeper thing? And the fact is, no, we're actually not, because it's just for consumers and they're all going into debt now. So who gives a shit? But in an ideal world, we would actually be educating them.
No, I mean, this is really where I come down. I totally agree with Danny. Like I said, I think if I were a pro-Israel Jewish student that had watched the last 10 years and particularly watched the unfolding since 2020 and seen that the playbook is that if you say you've experienced racism, it's racism. And you say you've experienced discomfort, then it's, whatever. I would feel like my institutions have been slow to react. And one of the things that I think is a sort of piece of evidence that sort of tells the story is that most of these elite institutions are not rolling out their diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. They're starting parallel anti-Semitism task forces and committees and whatever, which goes to show that something about the DEI offices in that particular ideological constellation was inadequate to confronting anti-Semitism, right? Like if these institutions were prepared to tackle these thorny questions, right, then there would have been a DEI response, and there was not. And they've had to create parallel institutions, and they're not at all reckoning with the tension between the sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion mantras of settler colonialism and anti-racism and whatever else, and sort of the pillaring of whiteness, and then, what is going on campus, right? They're just creating parallel institutions that are dealing with these problems separately and not reconciling any of the tension. But to Danny's point, I mean, colleges have become luxury resorts with bad hotel rooms for students to do drugs and have sex in, and then go become consultants. But in a perfect world where that was not the case, right, I think we would be trying to educate them about these difficult conversations.